The church stood solemn and imposing under a grey morning sky. Inside, soft candlelight flickered against worn pews. The air carried the scent of incense and damp stone. As the congregation gathered for Mass, an unsettling tension hung in the room, unnoticed by most but palpable to those attuned to the slightest disruptions. Father Dominic, a man of conviction but weathered by years of doubt, stood at the altar. He carried the weight of his congregation's faith and his inner turmoil, questioning whether his work still held meaning. His calm voice masked his personal struggles, making him a symbol of strength for a community that relied on his guidance through their trials. Just as Father Dominic raised his hands for prayer, a scruffy, mud-smeared dog burst into the sanctuary, barking ferociously. The noise shattered the reverent silence, leaving the congregation startled and confused. The dog darted through the pews, heading straight for the altar, its claws scratching frantically at the stone. Gasps filled the room as the animal growled, its eyes fixed on something no one else could see. "Whose dog is this?" Father Dominic asked, his voice shaky. No one replied. The dog's barking turned into a desperate howl before it collapsed, its paw resting on the altar base. The priest hesitated, then approached. As he knelt beside the dog, a low, rhythmic thumping emanated from beneath the stone. Something, or someone, was trapped below. Father Dominic's life revolved around the church, nestled in a quiet village where everyone knew each other. The people saw him as their moral compass, a man who had buried their dead, baptized their children, and counseled their troubled souls. Yet Dominic felt increasingly isolated. The rectory where he lived alone was cold and empty, its silence broken only by the ticking of an old clock. Each night, Dominic wrestled with doubt, wondering if his efforts truly made a difference. His faith, once unshakable, now felt fragile. The village itself was steeped in tradition. The church bells rang at dawn, calling people to prayer. Markets buzzed with life, and children played in the cobblestone streets. But beneath this lively facade, there were whispers, rumors of disappearances and strange occurrences that the villagers dismissed as superstition. Father Dominic dismissed them too, though unease gnawed at him. Dominic's closest confidant was Sister Agnes, a sharp-tongued but kind-hearted nun. Agnes had served the church for decades, often acting as Dominic's voice of reason. Where he doubted, she believed. Her unwavering faith both comforted and frustrated him. Then there was Gabriel, the young altar boy, whose curiosity often led him into trouble. Gabriel adored Dominic, seeing him as a father figure. His bright energy brought warmth to the church, though Dominic sometimes worried about the boy's penchant for asking difficult questions. Lastly, there was Mrs. Carter, an elderly widow who attended Mass daily. Known for her cryptic stories, she often spoke of the old ways, hinting at darker times before the church stood as a beacon of light. While most dismissed her ramblings, Dominic couldn't help but wonder if there was truth in her tales. These relationships formed the heart of Dominic's world, grounding him even as his faith wavered. The dog's sudden appearance during Mass sent shockwaves through the congregation. After the service was disrupted, Father Dominic decided to investigate the sound beneath the altar. With the help of Sister Agnes and Gabriel, he moved the heavy stone slab. Beneath the altar, they discovered a rusted metal grate, bolted shut. From within, faint thumping sounds grew louder. Gabriel leaned closer, his wide eyes reflecting a mix of fear and fascination. "What's down there, Father?" he whispered. Dominic hesitated, torn between fear and duty. "We'll find out," he said, summoning courage. Agnes retrieved a crowbar, and together they pried the grate open. A foul smell wafted out, causing them to recoil. As they shone a flashlight into the darkness, Dominic's breath hitched. At the bottom of a narrow stone shaft lay a figure, curled up and motionless. The rhythmic sound was the person's heartbeat, faint but steady. They were alive. "Call for help," Dominic instructed Agnes, but she hesitated. "Father, look closer," she urged. Dominic did, and his heart sank. The figure was bound with crude, ritualistic markings carved into their skin. Father Dominic felt a surge of anger and fear. Who had done this, and why? The markings on the figure suggested something far darker than he'd ever encountered. He climbed down the shaft carefully, his hands trembling as he reached the bound figure. The person, a young woman, stirred slightly, her cracked lips parting to whisper a single word: "Beware." Back above ground, Agnes and Gabriel helped Dominic lift her out. She was frail, barely breathing and covered in grime. Dominic carried her to the rectory, where they laid her on a makeshift bed. As Agnes tended to her wounds, Dominic prayed silently, asking for guidance. The villagers gathered outside the church, drawn by rumors of what had transpired. Whispers of curses and dark forces spread like wildfire. Mrs. Carter pushed her way to the front, her eyes wide with fear. "This is just like before," she muttered. Dominic confronted her. "What do you mean before?" he asked. Mrs. Carter hesitated before explaining how decades ago similar incidents had plagued the village. People had disappeared, and strange symbols were found etched into walls and trees. They said it was a punishment, but no one knew why, she added. As night fell, the church grew eerily quiet. Inside the rectory, the young woman stirred. Her eyes opened briefly, and she mumbled incoherent words. Among them, Dominic caught fragments: shadows, sacrifice, and altar. Agnes frowned. "We need answers," she said. Gabriel, ever curious, suggested searching the church records. Dominic agreed, though dread weighed heavy on him. The search through the church archives unearthed a chilling discovery. Buried in old brittle pages was a record of rituals conducted centuries ago, meant to seal something beneath the church. The writings were vague, but referenced a pact made to protect the village at a terrible cost. Dominic's hands trembled as he read. Was the woman beneath the altar connected to this forgotten history? And if so, had they unleashed something by freeing her? Before he could process the implications, the church bells rang out on their own. The sound was deafening, echoing through the village. Dominic rushed outside, his heart pounding. The villagers stood frozen, their faces pale with fear. From the shadows of the forest surrounding the church, a guttural growl resonated. The dog, now recovered, stood at the edge of the woods, barking once more. It was no longer warning them, it was challenging whatever lurked beyond. The church bell echoed through the small town, signaling the beginning of another Sunday Mass. Father Elijah stood at the altar, his voice strong yet calm, guiding the congregation through the prayers. The usual calm of the service was abruptly shattered by the sound of a dog barking outside. The noise grew louder, insistent, almost desperate. The congregation exchanged uneasy glances, whispers rippling through the pews. Father Elijah tried to maintain the flow of the service, but the dog's relentless barking made it impossible. Finally, the priest paused, addressing the disturbance directly. "Someone, please check what's going on outside," he requested, his tone firm but tinged with concern. Matthew, a young parishioner who volunteered at the church, stood up reluctantly. He stepped outside, expecting to see a stray dog that had wandered into the courtyard. Instead, he found Rex, a German shepherd belonging to the local groundskeeper, Mr. Andrews. Rex was never known to cause a scene, and his current behavior was out of character. The dog barked furiously, clawing at the ground near a set of wooden doors leading to the church basement. Matthew crouched, trying to calm Rex, but the dog growled and tugged at his sleeve, as if urging him to follow. Inside, Father Elijah continued the service, his voice faltering as he noticed Matthew's absence. Moments later, the young man returned, visibly shaken. "Father," Matthew whispered, his voice trembling, "you need to come outside. It's Rex. He's acting strange, and he's trying to get us to open the basement." The congregation was now fully alert, their murmurs growing louder. Father Elijah exchanged a look with Sister Mary, the head nun, who nodded gravely. Together they stepped out into the courtyard, followed by a few curious parishioners. The scene outside was chaotic. Rex stood guard over the basement doors, barking ferociously. His normally calm demeanor was replaced by an intensity that unsettled everyone present. Father Elijah approached cautiously. "What's wrong, boy?" he asked softly, but Rex only barked louder, his claws scraping the wooden doors. "We need to open it," Sister Mary suggested, her voice steady but urgent. "Open the basement?" Father Elijah hesitated. "We haven't used it in years. Why would—" A sudden, high-pitched whine from Rex cut him off, followed by a low growl that seemed almost human in its anguish. "Something's down there," Matthew said firmly. "We can't ignore this." Father Elijah reluctantly agreed, motioning for Matthew to retrieve the keys. The congregation, now gathered around the scene, watched with bated breath. The basement doors creaked open, revealing a dark, musty staircase. A foul odor wafted up, causing several people to recoil. Rex immediately darted down the stairs, his barking echoing through the narrow passage. "Stay here," Father Elijah instructed the crowd, though his voice lacked its usual authority. He descended the stairs, Sister Mary close behind, her rosary clutched tightly in her hands. The basement was colder than expected, its stone walls damp and covered in moss. Rex stood near a wooden crate, barking incessantly. The crate was nailed shut, and faint scratching sounds could be heard from within. "What is this?" Father Elijah whispered, his heart pounding. Sister Mary stepped forward, her face pale but resolute. "We need to open it." Using a crowbar Matthew had fetched, Father Elijah pried the crate open. The lid fell to the ground with a loud thud, revealing its contents. A small, emaciated child, eyes wide with terror. The child flinched at the sudden light, shielding their face with trembling hands. Gasps erupted from those who had dared to follow down the stairs. "Dear God," Sister Mary breathed, kneeling beside the child. "Who would do this?" Father Elijah was too stunned to respond. The child was alive, but barely, their fragile body covered in bruises and dirt. Rex nuzzled the child gently, whining softly. "Get help," Father Elijah finally managed, his voice hoarse. Matthew sprinted up the stairs to call for medical assistance. As the paramedics arrived and the child was carried out, the church members began piecing together the horrifying reality. The basement had been forgotten for decades, used only for storage. Who had locked the child down there, and why? The police arrived shortly after, cordoning off the area and beginning their investigation. Father Elijah and Sister Mary provided what little information they could, but their answers only raised more questions. Rex, meanwhile, refused to leave the child's side, sitting vigilantly by the ambulance. The bond between the dog and the rescued child was undeniable, as though Rex had been their guardian all along. As the day turned to night, the church was eerily silent. Father Elijah sat in his office, replaying the events in his mind. The discovery had shaken him to his core, challenging everything he believed about the sanctity of the church. Sister Mary entered, her expression grim. "The police found something else," she said quietly. Father Elijah looked up, dread pooling in his stomach. "What?" "They found markings on the walls," she explained. "Symbols. They look ritualistic." The weight of her words hung in the air. Whatever had happened in that basement was far darker than they had initially realized. The symbols Sister Mary mentioned gnawed at Father Elijah's thoughts. They weren't ordinary graffiti. The precision and intent behind them suggested something far more sinister. As he walked down the now cordoned-off staircase into the basement, he felt a chill that had little to do with the damp air. Detective Harper, a no-nonsense woman with sharp eyes and a voice that brooked no argument, met him at the base of the stairs. She was studying the symbols with a flashlight, her expression unreadable. "Father," she began, her tone neutral, "do these mean anything to you?" Elijah examined the markings. They were crude but deliberate, a mix of ancient runes and unfamiliar sigils carved into the stone walls. "No," he admitted, though unease prickled at his skin. "I've never seen anything like them." Detective Harper nodded, but didn't look convinced. "We're bringing in an expert to analyze these. In the meantime, I need you to think hard. Has anyone been down here recently? Anyone with a key?" Elijah shook his head. This basement hasn't been accessed in years. The only keys were kept in the church office, and they've always been accounted for. As Harper continued her questioning, Sister Mary entered the basement, clutching an old leather-bound book. Her face was pale, her hands trembling slightly as she handed it to Father Elijah. "I found this in the archives," she said quietly. "It was buried under a pile of hymnals. I think it might explain the symbols." Elijah opened the book, its brittle pages yellowed with age. The text was handwritten, a mix of Latin and an older dialect he couldn't immediately identify. What caught his attention were the illustrations, sketches of the very same symbols etched into the basement walls. "This is disturbing," Elijah murmured. "Disturbing doesn't even begin to cover it," Harper interjected. "What does it say?" Elijah skimmed the text, his Latin rusty but sufficient to grasp the basics. "It mentions rituals meant to bind or summon something. It's not clear what, but it implies a need for human sacrifice." Harper's jaw tightened. So someone revived these rituals. But why here? Why now? Elijah didn't have an answer. As the investigation progressed, the rescued child, now identified as Mia, remained hospitalized. Doctors reported she was malnourished and dehydrated, but otherwise unharmed. What puzzled them, however, was her refusal to speak. Despite their best efforts, Mia remained silent, her eyes wide with fear any time someone asked about the basement. Rex stayed by Mia's side, his presence a rare source of comfort for her. The dog seemed to have an almost supernatural connection with the girl, often reacting to her emotions before she even moved. Meanwhile, the townspeople were restless. Rumors about the symbols and their connection to ancient rituals spread like wildfire. Many began avoiding the church altogether, afraid of what else might be uncovered. One evening, as Father Elijah sat in his office, a loud knock at the door startled him. He opened it to find an elderly man leaning heavily on a cane. "You don't know me," the man began, his voice rasping with age, "but I know about that basement." Elijah gestured for the man to enter, his curiosity piqued. "My name's Samuel," the man said, settling into a chair. "I used to live here, long before you arrived. That basement, it's cursed." "Cursed?" Elijah echoed, skeptical but intrigued. Samuel nodded. Decades ago, before this church was even built, there was a group, a cult. They used that land for their rituals. They believed they could summon something powerful, something that would grant them eternal life. But the rituals required sacrifices, innocent lives. Elijah's stomach churned. And the church was built on top of this? The town thought they were burying the past, Samuel explained. They thought if they sanctified the ground, it would cleanse the evil. But some things can't be cleansed. As Samuel spoke, a low growl echoed from outside the office. Rex stood at the door, his hackles raised, his teeth bared. "What's wrong, boy?" Elijah asked, his heart pounding. Rex barked once sharply, then darted down the hall. Elijah and Samuel followed, their footsteps echoing in the empty church. The dog led them to the sanctuary, where the altar candles flickered despite the absence of wind. Rex stood rigid, staring at the crucifix above the altar. And then they saw it. The symbols from the basement were now etched into the walls of the sanctuary, glowing faintly in the candlelight. "This isn't possible," Elijah whispered, his voice trembling. Samuel crossed himself. "It's happening again. They're trying to finish what they started." Detective Harper was called immediately, her team arriving within minutes. The church was locked down, the sanctuary treated as a new crime scene. Harper questioned Samuel extensively, though his account offered little actionable evidence. As the investigation deepened, tensions in the town reached a boiling point. Some residents demanded the church be demolished, while others insisted on a public exorcism. Father Elijah, torn between faith and fear, began to question his own beliefs. Had the church truly been a sanctuary, or had it been a vessel for something darker all along? The turning point came late one night when Rex began barking furiously outside Mia's hospital room. The staff rushed to her side, only to find the child convulsing, her small body racked with seizures. Doctors worked frantically to stabilize her, but Rex's barking only grew louder. It wasn't until a nurse brought him into the room that Mia's convulsions stopped. The dog lay beside her, his presence seemingly calming her. But Mia's eyes, usually filled with fear, now glowed with an unnatural light. She turned to Father Elijah, who had arrived moments earlier, and spoke her first words since her rescue. "They're coming," she said, her voice hollow and otherworldly. "You have to stop them." Father Elijah could hardly breathe. Mia's words echoed in his mind, a chilling warning that seemed to open a door to a nightmare he couldn't fully comprehend. "They're coming." The words felt like a threat, a prophecy, something far beyond what he had ever imagined. Sister Mary entered the room, her face pale, her usual calm demeanor replaced by visible fear. "Father, we need to talk. There's more." She motioned for Elijah to follow her into the hallway, away from Mia's bedside. As soon as they were out of earshot, she lowered her voice. "I've been researching the symbols, those that were in the basement and now on the walls. They're not just linked to ancient rituals. They are a call, a summoning." "A summoning?" Elijah repeated, his mind racing. "But Mia, the child, what does she have to do with this?" Mary hesitated, her eyes darting around nervously. "It's not the child itself, Father. It's the bloodline. Mia is the key." She took a deep breath. Her family, the bloodline that leads back to the cult, they were the ones who tried to bring the entity into our world. That's what the rituals were for, opening the door between worlds. Elijah's heart pounded. "And now Mia is the last link?" Mary nodded gravely. "They've been waiting for her to be born. She's the last of the bloodline, and she's being drawn into something far darker than we could imagine." The news hit him like a punch to the gut. The thought of a child being used as a vessel for something so horrific filled him with dread. But what scared him even more was the possibility that the entity might already be inside her. Elsewhere, Detective Harper was piecing together the puzzle. She had a team of specialists working around the clock, and the evidence was beginning to fall into place. The symbols, the ritualistic markings, and even Mia's inexplicable connection to Rex. The signs were unmistakable. Something powerful, something ancient, was about to break free. Harper had her own suspicions about the cult, about the priesthood's involvement, but she knew she had to be careful. One wrong move, and it could all fall apart. She couldn't afford to be seen as someone who was merely investigating a possible criminal case anymore. There was something more at play here, something supernatural. Back at the church, Father Elijah was a man consumed by the weight of his responsibility. He stood before the altar, his hands trembling as he clutched the old book that Mary had found in the archives. The passages were cryptic, but the meaning was clear. If Mia was to be sacrificed, the entity would rise again, stronger than before. It would consume the town, perhaps even the entire world. In the sanctuary, Rex barked relentlessly at the shadows, his eyes fixed on the pulpit. His growls grew louder, almost feral, as if sensing something dark closing in. Elijah knew the dog wasn't just reacting to ordinary threats. He was attuned to something much more dangerous. He turned to Sister Mary. "We need to prepare. We can't let this happen." She nodded. "We must stop them before it's too late, but we don't know who they are. It could be anyone, someone in this town, someone with knowledge of the cult, or even someone who wants to use Mia as a pawn." Father Elijah's gaze turned to the door. He could feel it, the tension in the air, the sense of impending doom. The time for preparation was running out. It wasn't just Mia's life on the line, it was the life of everyone who called this town home. The clock struck midnight, and the town seemed to hold its breath. Mia's room in the hospital was surrounded by guards, yet the tension outside her door was palpable. Rex was at her side again, growling, refusing to leave her. His eyes were focused on the shadows, and every now and then he would bark aggressively at nothing at all. Father Elijah stood at the church, staring at the symbols that had now appeared on the altar. The glow from the candles illuminated the carvings, casting a sinister light. It was happening. Whatever was about to unfold was beyond anything he had prepared for. A distant sound, a low hum, reached his ears. It came from the direction of the hospital, faint at first, but growing louder. It was a chanting, ancient and haunting. Elijah's blood ran cold as the realization hit him. Someone had started the ritual. It was too late to stop it now. At the hospital, Mia's eyes were wide open, her pupils dilated as if in a trance. Her small hand reached out toward Rex, who, despite his fierce loyalty, seemed almost paralyzed with fear. The chanting echoed through the hallways, reverberating off the sterile walls. Detective Harper had already arrived, rushing through the hospital corridors, her badge visible and her gun drawn. She had no idea what was happening, but she could feel the gravity of the situation. "Get to Mia's room now!" she shouted to the officers with her, her voice filled with urgency. As the officers burst through the door, they found Mia standing in the center of the room, her back to them, her head tilted unnaturally to one side. Rex was growling fiercely, his teeth bared, but he wasn't moving. Mia's small body shuddered as the chanting grew louder. Then, for a split second, everything went silent. And in that silence, Mia spoke. "They're here." The room seemed to tremble, as if the very air around them was charged with electricity. The officers stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. Before anyone could react, the door to the room slammed shut with a force that shook the walls. The lights flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness. The chanting now filled the room, a cacophony of voices that seemed to come from every direction. In the chaos, Father Elijah arrived, breathless and frantic. He saw Mia, standing in the center of the room, her body rigid, her eyes glowing with an eerie light. Rex was beside her, now silent but still watchful, his fur bristling. The room was thick with a presence. Something was there, something powerful, something malevolent. Father Elijah stepped forward, his voice trembling but steady. "In the name of God, I command you to leave." But Mia didn't respond. Instead, she slowly turned her head to face him, her mouth curling into a grotesque smile that was not her own. Her voice, now layered with a deep, unearthly tone, spoke again. "You cannot stop what has already begun." Father Elijah stood at the threshold of the room, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. Mia's face was twisted, a sickening smile playing on her lips as her eyes glowed with an unnatural light. The room seemed to pulse with energy, the air thick with malevolent intent. "Father, you can't stop it." Mia's voice echoed again, a low guttural sound. "It's already inside." Rex growled lowly beside her, his teeth bared, but his body was stiff with terror. The dog knew better than anyone the entity Mia was hosting. Father Elijah stepped closer, his heart pounding in his chest. He had seen evil before, but nothing like this. It was beyond human understanding. The room grew colder, and the once faint chanting became louder, more pronounced, almost as if the walls themselves were speaking. The ground trembled beneath their feet. Something powerful, ancient, was awakening. The cult's ritual had been completed, and now Mia was the key to its final release. Father Elijah turned to Detective Harper, who stood frozen in the doorway, her gun lowered but still in hand. "Get out!" he shouted, his voice hoarse. "Get everyone out of here now!" Harper hesitated, unsure of what to do. The gravity of the situation had only just begun to hit her. There was no escaping what was happening now. She had been trained to handle dangerous criminals, but this was beyond anything her training had prepared her for. "I'm not leaving without Mia," Harper finally said, her voice steady despite the fear that crept into her eyes. Father Elijah's gaze locked onto hers, his expression one of desperation. "You don't understand. She's not herself anymore. What's inside her will kill everyone." But Harper shook her head, determination hardening her features. "I can't just let her die like this." The temperature in the room continued to plummet as the chanting reached a deafening crescendo. Mia's body trembled violently as her hands clenched into fists. A low growl rumbled from her throat. The transformation was happening, and there was no way to stop it. Father Elijah had only one option left. He had spent years studying ancient texts, practicing rituals, but none of them had prepared him for this moment. He had to make a choice: confront the entity inside Mia, or allow it to escape and destroy everything. He reached into his robes and pulled out a small vial of holy water. The vial had been passed down through generations of priests, said to hold the power to banish darkness from even the most insidious of beings. Elijah had never used it before, not on something this powerful, but he had no other choice. He stepped forward, holding the vial high, and recited a prayer. The words felt strange on his tongue, a part of him unsure if they would have any effect at all. As he spoke, the air around them seemed to vibrate. The glow in Mia's eyes flickered, and for a brief moment, the girl who had once been kind and innocent seemed to return. "Mia," Elijah whispered, his voice soft. "Mia, can you hear me?" For a split second, Mia's expression softened, her lips trembling as if she were fighting to break free. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the smile returned, more monstrous than before. "You think you can save me?" Mia's voice was no longer her own. It was deep, booming, layered with the essence of the creature inside her. "I am the door." The doors to the room burst open, and Sister Mary entered, clutching an ancient relic, a silver cross that had been blessed by generations of the church's holiest priests. The relic had the power to bind the entity and prevent it from crossing over. Her eyes met Father Elijah's, and she knew what had to be done. "We have to act now," she said, her voice filled with urgency. "This is the only way." Elijah nodded, stepping aside as Mary moved to Mia's side. The air in the room seemed to thicken, the pressure unbearable as the ritual reached its climax. Mary placed the cross against Mia's chest, whispering a prayer of protection. For a moment, nothing happened. But then a loud crackling sound filled the room, and Mia screamed, her body writhing in agony as if being torn apart from the inside. The glow in her eyes intensified, and the room seemed to shake. The chanting became deafening. Father Elijah dropped to his knees, his hands pressed to his ears as the noise overwhelmed him. He could feel the power of the entity growing stronger, threatening to tear apart everything they had worked for. But they couldn't stop now. They were so close. Suddenly, the door to the room flung open with a violent crash, and Detective Harper rushed in, her face a mask of determination. "You need to stop this," she shouted, her voice cutting through the chaos. "You're killing her." Father Elijah looked up, his face a mixture of sorrow and resolve. "She's not the same person anymore, Detective. The entity inside her won't stop until it's free." Harper's eyes locked onto Mia, who was convulsing on the floor, her body jerking violently. She could see the girl's pain, the struggle to break free, but it was clear the entity had taken full control. Without thinking, Harper rushed forward, grabbing the silver cross from Sister Mary's hands. "I won't let you do this," she cried out. "Mia's a victim in all of this. You can't just give up on her." Father Elijah tried to stop her, but it was too late. Harper pressed the cross to Mia's forehead, and for a moment, everything went still. The air grew heavier, suffocating, as the entity inside Mia writhed and screamed. Mia's eyes locked onto Harper's, and for the first time, a flicker of recognition shone through the darkness. "Mia, you have to fight it," Harper whispered, tears streaming down her face. The room fell silent. Then, with a final, deafening scream, the light in Mia's eyes flickered out. The room seemed to hold its breath. For what felt like an eternity, no one moved. Then, slowly, Mia's body relaxed, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Rex, who had been silent for what seemed like hours, walked cautiously to her side, licking her hand. Father Elijah stood, his hands trembling as he looked at Mia. He had witnessed countless horrors in his years as a priest, but this had been different. They had saved her. Somehow, against all odds, they had saved her. Harper looked over at Elijah. Is she okay?" Elijah nodded, though there was still uncertainty in his eyes. She will be. But this is far from over. The entity had been contained, but it had not been destroyed. It was still out there, still waiting for the right moment to return, and when it did, they would have to be ready. The town slowly returned to its normal rhythm. The sun rose over the horizon, casting a golden light over the buildings, as if the night had never happened. Mia, though physically recovered, was different. Her eyes were filled with a wisdom far beyond her years, and the weight of what she had endured was evident in every step she took. Father Elijah walked beside her, his face lined with exhaustion, but also relief. They had won, but the cost had been high. "I'm sorry, Mia," Elijah said softly, his voice filled with regret. "I didn't protect you when I should have." Mia smiled faintly, her eyes steady. "You did the best you could." As they walked, the faintest growl from Rex echoed behind them, a reminder that the battle was far from over. They didn't know what the future held, but for now, they had each other, and that was enough.